Most people completely misunderstand what happens when an avoidant and their partner both disappear at the same time. They think silence means the relationship is dead. It usually doesn't. What actually happens is far more psychological than romantic. Because when two people simultaneously stop reaching out, the relationship leaves the external world and enters the nervous system. And that's where the real battle starts. See, an avoidant person survives through emotional distance. Distance gives them regulation. Space gives them control. Predictability lowers emotional pressure. But there's a huge difference between choosing distance and having distance chosen for them. That changes everything. The moment you stop contacting them too, the avoidant loses something extremely important. Access. Not necessarily love. Not necessarily connection. Access. Your attention. Your predictability. Your emotional availability. And human beings psychologically value what they can no longer easily reach. At first, though, you probably won't see this reaction. In the beginning stages of mutual no contact, the avoidant often appears completely unaffected. Sometimes they even seem right, relieved. They sleep better. They distract themselves. They become productive. They go out more. They immerse themselves in work, hobbies, entertainment, or routines. Why? Because the immediate removal of emotional pressure creates temporary nervous system relief. That relief is real. But here's what most people never understand. Avoidants are often delayed emotional processors. An anxious person feels abandonment immediately. An avoidant often feels freedom first and loss later. That delay confuses people. The partner sitting at home suffering assumes they never cared, but internally, the avoidant nervous system is doing something very different. It's decompressing first, then recalculating, then noticing the absence, then replaying interactions, then wondering why you disappeared too. And eventually, curiosity becomes psychological tension. This is where silence becomes dangerous. Because the human brain hates unfinished emotional patterns, especially when attachment is involved. The moment communication disappears, the mind starts filling gaps with imagination. That happens to both people. You begin wondering, are they thinking about me? Did they move? Are they happier now? Do they miss me? Meanwhile, the avoidant often begins asking entirely different questions. Why did they stop chasing? Why are they okay without me? Did I lose control of the connection? Are they emotionally detaching? Those questions matter because avoidants often regulate closeness through distance management. But when you also create distance, they lose the ability to control the emotional pacing of the relationship. And psychologically, that creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates focus. Focus creates obsession. Not always romantic obsession, but cognitive obsession. You start occupying mental space because the pattern changed unexpectedly. Now here's where people make a major mistake. They think no contact is a manipulation tactic. It's not supposed to be. Healthy no contact is not designed to force somebody back. It's designed to restore emotional clarity. Because when communication stops, masks begin falling off. You stop performing. They stop reacting. And both people finally confront themselves without constant emotional stimulation. This is why no contact becomes such a revealing psychological experiment. The anxious partner often discovers how much of their identity was built around pursuit, checking phones, waiting for messages, monitoring emotional shifts, living inside uncertainty. And the avoidant discovers something equally uncomfortable. Emotional numbness is not emotional peace. That realization hits quietly, usually late at night, usually during moments of stillness. Because distraction can suppress attachment feelings temporarily, but it rarely erases them. And once enough time passes, memory becomes selective. The brain starts highlighting emotional peaks instead of emotional exhaustion. This is why avoidants sometimes reappear weeks or months later, sounding strangely emotional. They finally processed what the anxious person felt at the beginning. Delayed grief, delayed attachment activation, delayed emotional awareness. Now, does this mean every avoidant comes back? And that's important. Because attachment patterns are not destiny. Some avoidants double down on distance permanently, especially if vulnerability feels threatening to their identity. Others return the moment they sense emotional safety again. But here's the deeper truth nobody talks about. The outcome of no contact depends on whether both people evolved during the silence. Not whether they missed each other. Missing someone proves attachment. Growth proves readiness. Those are not the same thing. Two people can deeply miss each other and still recreate the exact same destructive cycle. Because chemistry without self-awareness becomes repetition. And repetition feels like fate when it's actually conditioning. So when an avoidant and you both go no contact, something very strange happens. The relationship stops being powered by interaction and starts being powered by reflection. That's when reality surfaces. Not the fantasy, not the emotional panic, not the temporary withdrawal symptoms. Reality. Was the connection healthy? Was the intimacy reciprocal? Was the relationship emotionally sustainable? Or was one person chasing while the other person escaped? Silence exposes these answers with brutal honesty. And eventually, one of three things usually happens. First, one person breaks no contact impulsively because discomfort became unbearable. Second, both people emotionally detach and the bond dissolves naturally over time. Third, both individuals grow enough separately to communicate differently if reconnection happens. That third outcome is the rarest, because real change requires identity-level work, not temporary loneliness. And this is why no contact affects avoidance so powerfully. For the first time, they can no longer measure the relationship through your pursuit. They have to measure it through absence, through memory, through emotional residue, through what life feels like without guaranteed access to you. And sometimes, that's the first moment they genuinely feel the weight of the connection. Not because you convinced them, not because you argued, not because you chased, but because silence removed all distractions, and the truth finally became loud. No contact is never neutral, because silence does not create emotional stillness. It creates psychological movement beneath the surface. The moment two people stop communicating at the same time, both nervous systems begin reacting automatically, even if neither person says a word. Most people think silence means nothing is happening, but in reality, silence often becomes the loudest part of the relationship. It removes distraction, removes reassurance, and removes access. That is when the mind begins filling the empty space with emotion, memory, and interpretation. When an avoidant and their partner both go silent, the reactions are rarely the same. One person may feel immediate anxiety, confusion, and emotional withdrawal symptoms. The other may initially feel relief, calmness, or even a sense of freedom. This difference creates massive misunderstanding. The anxious person assumes the avoidant never cared because they do not react outwardly right away. But avoidants often process emotions in delayed stages. Their nervous system first reacts to the removal of pressure, not the removal of attachment. That distinction matters. At first, the avoidant may enjoy the quiet. There are no difficult conversations, no emotional demands, and no pressure to explain themselves. Their brain interprets the silence as safety. But as time passes, something changes internally. The absence becomes noticeable. Predictable access disappears. The person who once chased, texted, checked in, or emotionally pursued them is suddenly gone too. That disruption creates uncertainty, and uncertainty forces attention. The human brain is deeply affected by unfinished emotional patterns. When communication suddenly stops, the mind naturally starts replaying memories and searching for answers. Both people begin imagining scenarios they cannot verify. Questions start growing in the silence. Are they moving on? Do they miss me? Why haven't they reached out? The nervous system treats uncertainty like a problem that needs solving, which is why no contact can feel emotionally consuming even when nothing is physically happening. Silence also removes emotional performance. During constant communication, people react impulsively, defend themselves, chase reassurance, or avoid vulnerability. But no contact strips away those behaviors. Without interaction, both people are eventually left alone with their real emotional state. That is why no contact feels so psychologically intense. It forces reflection without distraction. In many cases, the avoidant only begins fully feeling the emotional weight of the relationship after enough silence has passed. What looked like indifference in the beginning may actually have been delayed emotional processing. And by the time those feelings surface, the entire emotional dynamic has already changed. Avoidants experience emotions very differently from highly anxious or emotionally expressive people, and this difference confuses almost everyone who becomes attached to them. When conflict happens, when a breakup occurs, or when no contact begins, the avoidant often appears calm, detached, unaffected, or even relieved. To the other person, this behavior feels cold and emotionally disconnected. It creates the impression that the avoidant never cared deeply in the first place. But what most people fail to understand is that avoidants are often delayed emotional processors. Their emotions do not disappear. They simply arrive later. In the beginning stages of separation, an avoidant nervous system usually prioritizes self-protection over emotional reflection. Emotional intensity feels overwhelming to them, so the brain immediately looks for ways to reduce pressure and restore internal control. That is why many avoidants initially throw themselves into work, routines, hobbies, entertainment, travel, social distractions, or personal goals after a breakup. It is not always because they are happy the relationship ended. Often, it is because distance temporarily calms their nervous system. For a short period of time, silence can feel like relief. There are no emotionally loaded conversations, no expectations, no vulnerability demands, and no fear of disappointing someone emotionally. The avoidant feels lighter because the immediate pressure is gone. Meanwhile, the anxious partner is usually experiencing the exact opposite reaction. They feel panic, abandonment, grief, and emotional withdrawal immediately. This difference in timing creates one of the biggest misunderstandings in attachment dynamics. The anxious person thinks, if they loved me, they would already miss me. But avoidants often do not process loss in real time. They suppress first and feel later. Their brain disconnects from emotional discomfort temporarily so they can maintain stability. However, emotional suppression is not emotional resolution. Feelings that are pushed down do not vanish. They stay underneath the surface waiting for quiet moments to return. Eventually, the distractions stop working as effectively. The routine becomes normal again. The silence becomes noticeable. And slowly, the avoidant begins revisiting memories, conversations, emotional moments, and unresolved feelings. This is often when delayed grief begins. They may suddenly miss the person intensely weeks or even months after the breakup, long after the other person expected any emotional reaction. What makes this process so powerful is that avoidants usually experience emotions privately. Unlike anxious individuals who process externally through talking, seeking reassurance, or expressing pain openly, avoidants internalize most of their emotional reactions. From the outside, they still appear composed. But internally, the emotional processing can become extremely heavy once it finally surfaces. This delayed emotional experience is why avoidants sometimes return unexpectedly after long periods of silence. By the time they finally feel the emotional weight of the loss, the other person may already be healing, detaching, or emotionally transforming. The avoidant's emotional timeline simply operates differently. Their calmness in the beginning was not always proof of indifference. In many cases, it was proof that their nervous system postponed the emotional impact until it felt safe enough to finally process it. Silence creates psychological amplification because the human mind is not designed to sit comfortably inside uncertainty for long periods of time. When communication suddenly disappears between two emotionally connected people, the brain immediately starts trying to fill the missing information. That process changes how both individuals think, remember, and emotionally experience the relationship. In many cases, silence becomes more psychologically intense than actual interaction because the imagination begins replacing reality. When people are actively communicating, even unhealthy relationships feel predictable. There is structure. There are reactions, responses, arguments, reassurances, and emotional signals. But the moment silence enters the dynamic, all of those external reference points disappear. The brain loses certainty, and uncertainty naturally increases mental focus. This is why people in no contact often think about each other constantly, even if they were emotionally exhausted during the relationship itself. The absence of communication creates space for projection. Without new information, the mind starts building stories to explain the silence. One person imagines the other moving on, finding someone new, or forgetting them completely. The other imagination: exclusion, abandonment, or emotional replacement. Neither person actually knows what is happening. But the brain dislikes emotional ambiguity so much that it begins inventing answers. This is where memory becomes distorted. During silence, people rarely replay the relationship objectively. Instead, the mind selectively highlights emotionally charged moments. Positive memories often become exaggerated while painful patterns temporarily fade into the background. An avoidant may suddenly remember the comfort, affection, safety, or emotional connection they once had, while minimizing the conflict or emotional pressure they previously focused on. The anxious partner may romanticize intimacy while forgetting how emotionally unstable the dynamic actually felt. Silence changes perception because memory is heavily influenced by emotional state. Curiosity also intensifies during no contact because access has been removed. Human beings naturally value what becomes uncertain or unavailable. When someone who once provided emotional attention suddenly disappears, the brain starts monitoring the loss more carefully. Questions begin repeating internally. Are they thinking about me? Why have? Are they reached out? Do they miss me? Are they happier without me? These thoughts become psychologically consuming because there are no answers to settle the uncertainty. Fantasy becomes another powerful force inside silence. Since there is no current interaction to balance reality, people often begin imagining future conversations, reconciliations, apologies, or emotional breakthroughs. They mentally rehearse scenarios repeatedly, creating emotional experiences entirely inside their own mind. In some cases, individuals become more emotionally attached during silence than they were during the actual relationship because imagination removes complexity and keeps only emotionally meaningful fragments. Silence also amplifies unresolved emotional wounds. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of inadequacy, and fear of vulnerability all become louder when there is no communication to soothe or distract the nervous system. This is why no contact can feel emotionally overwhelming even when nothing outwardly is happening. The absence of communication does not create emotional emptiness. It creates emotional magnification. Memory grows louder. Curiosity grows sharper. Fantasy, why grows stronger. And the emotional meaning attached to the relationship often becomes far more intense inside silence than it ever was during ordinary conversation. The power dynamic quietly shifts the moment you stop chasing an avoidant because the emotional structure of the relationship suddenly changes. In many avoidant dynamics, one person unconsciously becomes the pursuer while the avoidant becomes the distancer. Over time, this pattern creates emotional predictability. The avoidant learns that no matter how much space they take, how inconsistent they become, or how emotionally unavailable they appear, the other person will eventually reach back out, seek reassurance, restart communication, or attempt to repair the connection. That predictability becomes psychologically stabilizing for them, even if they never consciously admit it. The chasing behavior creates a hidden emotional safety net. The avoidant may resist closeness, but they still grow accustomed to knowing the connection remains available. They expect emotional access to remain open, even while maintaining distance. As long as the other person continues pursuing, the avoidant rarely has to confront the possibility of truly losing the relationship. The emotional pressure stays manageable because they still feel indirectly in control of the pacing and distance within the connection. But the moment the chasing stops, something changes internally. The emotional pattern they unconsciously relied on suddenly disappears. The avoidant notices the absence of pursuit first, even before they fully process the emotional loss itself. The texts stop. The emotional checking in disappears. The attempts to reconnect vanish. The predictable reassurance they quietly depended on is no longer arriving. That disruption creates psychological uncertainty, and uncertainty immediately changes perception. Human beings instinctively pay closer attention to what becomes less accessible. When emotional availability is withdrawn, the brain begins reassessing the value of the connection. The avoidant who once felt crowded may suddenly feel disconnected. The person they assumed would always remain emotionally available now feels unpredictable and emotionally distant themselves. That reversal often creates curiosity, heightened awareness, and internal discomfort. This shift is powerful because avoidants are often more sensitive to loss of access than direct emotional confrontation. Emotional pursuit can sometimes make them withdraw further because it activates pressure and vulnerability fears. But silence removes pressure while simultaneously removing certainty. Without someone chasing them, they can no longer measure the relationship through control of distance. They are forced to experience the connection from a completely different emotional position. At first, they may try to ignore the shift. They may distract themselves, rationalize the silence, or assume the other person will eventually return like before. But as time passes, the emotional reality changes. The lack of pursuit creates space for reflection. Questions begin appearing internally. Why did they stop? Are they moving on? Did I lose emotional access to them? These thoughts matter because the avoidant nervous system often reacts strongly when emotional certainty disappears. The shift in power is not about manipulation or playing games. Healthy detachment is not designed to punish anyone. The shift happens naturally because emotional energy is no longer flowing in only one direction. The relationship dynamic becomes balanced for the first time. And in that silence, the avoidant is finally forced to confront the connection without relying on the reassurance of being constantly pursued. Both people enter withdrawal cycles during no contact because emotional attachment is not just psychological, it is neurological. Human connection creates patterns inside the brain that become familiar, emotionally regulating, and deeply conditioned over time. When a relationship suddenly loses communication, the brain reacts to that absence in ways that are surprisingly similar to withdrawal responses seen in other forms of dependency. This is why no contact can feel physically uncomfortable, mentally obsessive, and emotionally destabilizing even when the relationship itself was unhealthy. During a close emotional bond, the brain becomes accustomed to regular stimulation connected to the other person. Messages, calls, attention, affection, reassurance, unpredictability, conflict, and reconciliation all create emotional highs and lows that the nervous system starts adapting to. Over time, the relationship becomes part of the brain's regulation system. The person is no longer just emotionally important, they become neurologically familiar. The moment no contact begins, that familiar emotional stimulation suddenly disappears. The nervous system notices the absence immediately. The brain begins searching for the missing connection because it has been conditioned to expect emotional input from that person. This is why people in no contact constantly feel urges to check their phone, revisit old conversations, look at social media, replay memories, or imagine reaching out. The brain is attempting to restore emotional equilibrium by reconnecting with the source of attachment. For anxious individuals, this withdrawal often appears immediately and intensely. Their nervous system reacts strongly to emotional separation because connection has become linked to safety and reassurance. Silence can trigger panic, intrusive thoughts, emotional rumination, loss of appetite, difficulty sleeping, and heightened emotional sensitivity. Their mind becomes consumed with restoring contact because the absence feels emotionally threatening. Avoidants experience withdrawal differently, but they are not immune to it. In the beginning, avoidants often feel relief because the immediate emotional pressure has disappeared. Without demands for vulnerability or closeness, their nervous system temporarily relaxes. But this relief is often misunderstood as emotional detachment. In reality, many avoidants simply process emotional withdrawal in delayed stages. As time passes and the silence continues, the avoidant brain also begins recognizing the absence of emotional familiarity. The person who once occupied space in their daily routine, emotional landscape, and mental focus is suddenly gone. The nervous system gradually begins reacting to that loss. Thoughts become more frequent, curiosity increases, emotional memories return unexpectedly. What initially felt peaceful may slowly begin feeling empty. Withdrawal cycles become especially intense because intermittent reinforcement often existed in the relationship beforehand. In unstable attachment dynamics, emotional inconsistency strengthens dependency patterns. Moments of affection mixed with distance create stronger emotional conditioning than steady stability. That is why people often struggle more to detach from emotionally inconsistent relationships than secure ones. No contact forces both people to confront these dependency patterns without immediate relief. The brain wants resolution, comfort, familiarity, and certainty, but silence blocks access to all of them. This creates emotional discomfort that can feel overwhelming at times. Yet this withdrawal phase is also revealing. It exposes how much emotional regulation was being outsourced to the relationship instead of developed internally. What happens next after no contact depends far less on emotion than most people realize. People often believe love is the deciding factor in whether a relationship survives, reconnects, or transforms. But love alone rarely determines the outcome. Many people deeply love each other and still destroy the relationship repeatedly because emotional patterns, attachment conditioning, and identity structures remain unchanged. The future of the connection is usually determined not by how strongly two people feel, but by how emotionally developed they are when those feelings become challenged. This is why intense emotional attachment can sometimes create the illusion of compatibility. During emotionally charged relationships, people mistake longing, obsession, chemistry, or emotional dependency for genuine relational health. But emotions are temporary. R.Y. states. Identity is the deeper system underneath them. Identity determines how someone handles conflict, vulnerability, rejection, closeness, accountability, communication, and emotional discomfort. And those patterns ultimately shape the relationship far more than romantic feelings alone. An avoidant may genuinely love someone while still pulling away whenever intimacy deepens. An anxious partner may genuinely love someone while still chasing, overreacting, or abandoning their own emotional stability for reassurance. In both cases, the problem is not lack of love. The problem is that their nervous systems are operating through conditioned survival patterns rather than emotional security. No contact often exposes this truth with brutal clarity. Once the emotional intensity settles, both people are left facing themselves without constant interaction distracting them. The anxious person may discover that much of their identity became attached to pursuit, validation, or fear of abandonment. The avoidant may realize that independence was being used as emotional protection rather than genuine self-sufficiency. Silence forces both individuals to confront the behaviors beneath the emotional oceans. This is why two people can miss each other terribly and still fail completely if they reconnect too soon. Missing someone is emotional. Building a healthy relationship requires emotional regulation, self-awareness, accountability, and nervous system stability. Without those qualities, the relationship simply returns to the same cycle under a different emotional mood. Attachment conditioning plays a massive role in this process. Human beings unconsciously repeat relational patterns learned through earlier emotional experiences. These patterns become automatic. An avoidant instinctively distances themselves when vulnerability feels threatening. An anxious partner instinctively seeks reassurance when emotional uncertainty appears. Both reactions feel natural to the individuals experiencing them, even when the behaviors damage the relationship. Real transformation happens only when identity changes beneath the emotional reactions. Emotional maturity means learning how to tolerate discomfort without escaping, chasing, shutting down, or becoming emotionally reactive. Self-regulation means being able to process emotions without making another person responsible for stabilizing your internal state. These abilities fundamentally reshape relationship outcomes. The future of the relationship depends on whether both people evolve during the silence. If the same attachment wounds remain untouched, the same emotional cycle eventually returns. But if both individuals develop greater emotional awareness, then they are more likely to be able to understand and relate to each other's feelings. Healthier communication and stronger internal stability, then the relationship dynamic itself changes. Love may begin the connection, but identity determines whether it survives.